Hi, my name is Chase Thornhill. I am Sarah Thornhill's lesser half. She's one of the new associates here. So Pastor Bill is not going to be here today, so he asked me to fill in. I understand that you all have been working through Genesis for quite some time. Yeah, so, and I understand that I think you might have one more chapter left, but I'm going to try and give you a break from that today. I guess the next series you all will be starting is on Paul, and so I will be doing just a little bit of an introduction to Paul. But before I get into Paul, I wanted to introduce myself briefly. For those of you who haven't met my wife, Sarah Thornhill, she's in charge of senior high and the college ministry. But she's an associate pastor here. She just recently got commissioned at annual conference a few weeks ago. So Sarah and I met at University of Oklahoma, where we both graduated, and I was a religious studies major, and so I did a lot of my work in biblical studies, primarily New Testament, and Sarah was psychology and nonprofit. So between us, we were bound for ministry. But Sarah went to Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary after she graduated, which is in Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago. And 2 years after, we got married and I followed. So Sarah's degree was a Master's of Divinity and kind of your generic degree for pastors. Within that, she's able to specialize a lot of work in nonprofit and preaching. And I did the Master's of Theological Studies, which is more geared towards the academic side. I had plans to go on and do a PhD. Those have been put on hold, but primarily my focus there was in racial justice, racial dynamics, and Christianity. Is doing a lot with theology. So that's my background. My first introduction to seminary work and religious studies was in Bible and actually in Paul. So I love it, and I hope that I can leave you all with more questions than you came in here with. So today's topic is going to be looking at the historical Paul, his context, his writings, and what environment formed Paul, the Paul that we have come to know today in our Bibles. So Paul was a Pharisee. We learn that in Acts, and we also hear him talk about that in Galatians. But when you look at Judaism in the First Temple period, the Second Temple period, the first century, is everything in Judaism at the time is informed by Hellenism, which is basically a mixture of Greek and Roman culture that is not as much of your classic or ancient Greek in the terms you would think of Homer or Socrates or Plato or Aristotle, but more of a advancement upon that, much more empire-centered, less on democracy as you see in the Republic from Plato. So when you think about how Judaism is informed by this, Paul's Judaism was much more what I like to call dualist. That's a fancy word for there was a very distinct bright line between good and evil. Paul first was exposed to the Hebrew Scriptures not in Hebrew, but in Greek. At the time, move this right here, at the time, that was all that he had access to. The Septuagint was translated in about the 3rd century BCE, and the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek was not so much of a translation as it was an interpretation. One of the biggest things you're going to find is that when it was translated, all of the words that you see for God, the names for God, Adonai, Yahweh, El Shaddai, in Hebrew, were those personal connections to those names, the personal nature of those names, were moved to a more generic, more universal meaning. So that's why you hear Paul use Lord or Kyrios in Greek so much. Now, the words themselves may not seem like that big of a difference, but when you put this into the context of Paul's mission, which was to go out and to convert the Gentiles outside of Judaism to Christianity, to the risen Christ, the impact of that, of those words, and how God was seen, conceptualized at the time, was quite different. So, Paul is not only raised in a Hellenistic context in terms of his Judaism, but also just in his everyday life. He grew up in Tarsus, which is the third biggest commercial hub in Southeast Asia Minor. And so when he begins going out into the mission field, you see him being very familiar with the different religions around the area, and the different cults. And scholars will show you, and I'm not going to get into the details of this because you could get a headache just by looking at one of them, will show you how Paul's imagery that he uses to explain the body of Christ is something that he almost translates and puts into terms that they would understand so that they can relate their religious experience and how they understand religion to how Paul has come to see the risen Christ. So, one more note on cosmic dualism really quick, because this may seem a little scattered. Hopefully it'll come back into focus here in a second, but I'm trying to set the context for right now. Cosmic dualism is in terms of how Hellenism understood divinity. Obviously, you have the side of good and the side of evil. An important thing to note here is that with the dualistic nature of good and evil, you have evil becoming less and less about, in terms of the Hebrew tradition, why is God punishing us? What sins have we committed? To there is some external evil that is opposed to God. That's why you see the concept of Satan or the devil as we know it today to arise and to appear for the first time in history in this era. Satan is basically the consolidation of all of those evil forces that are lumped into one figure. And then you see them looking back at the Hebrew Scriptures, for example, in Job, to almost re-look at and almost redefine what the role of Satan is in 8,000 years later after you see the story of Job taking place. So that is quite important, because when it comes to the apocalyptic worldview of Paul, in terms of the fast approaching end times, at least in his mind, the repenting of sins, and you see this in Jesus as just as much. The repenting of sins is no longer towards only having a right relationship with God to avoid God punishing one, but rather repenting against one's sins to not give the devil a stronghold. And so that will become very important as you all are reading Paul throughout the next few weeks, or as I understand how Bill does the next few decades. So, another thing about the context is the government. You all know about the Roman Empire. Certainly the stories, the passion narratives in all the Gospels brings into focus the Roman government and their relationship to Herod. And it is something that is much more complicated than I am equipped to explain. But in terms of Judaism, the Jews in the first century CE, and I'm hopefully you all are common with this. Instead of AD and BC, I use BCE for before Common Era, and then CE for the Common Era. The Jews were in about 160 BCE were expelled from the Roman Empire. And it wasn't until about 55 BCE that they were allowed back in. So at the time that Paul is writing, he has his revelation, his road to Damascus experience. And it's only been about 75, 80 years around there that the Jews have even been allowed back into the Roman Empire. And this is going to be really important when you consider texts like Romans 15, where it says all authority is instituted by God, and you are to obey authority. That is certainly something that we can take value from outside of the context of Paul, but also you have to consider that the context within which Paul is talking to Jews at the heart of the Roman Empire and Rome themselves, he is saying, in part, be careful, because your very existence depends on it. History has shown us that. And so Paul is in a unique situation to be saying this because it is said that he retained a Roman citizenship from his father, which, as you will see as your studies throughout the letters, for example, in Corinthians, both of them, as well as Philemon, you'll see that his Roman citizenship helps him get out of a couple of hairy situations, and is important to how he is able to have access to different groups and different cults in terms of his ministry to convert them. So, if you all, I know Pastor Bill doesn't normally ask for questions, but I'm not Pastor Bill. If you all do have any questions, please, I'm at a stopping point. If you have questions, I'd love to answer them because usually I'm about as clear as mud. So, yes, sir.
You're talking about the historical Paul. Have you seen the recent Bible series where Paul played a big role?
I have not, partially because I don't have TV. Can't afford cable, I know. But I've heard actually some good things about it. So, is it pretty good, pretty thorough?
It is thorough. Of course, they admit that there's a model of the Bible in one sense, and that's how it's in the relationship of Paul to James, Peter, and the people in Greece.
Yeah, well, the relationship between Paul and James and Peter is one that's very interesting. You all will discover this when you get into Galatians, that Paul is confronted by James and Peter when they visit him, or when he visits them, and is said, you're not teaching the gospel to the right people. You are teaching it to Gentiles and to the pagans. And he says, no, we have very different ministries. And the risen Christ and the gospel are not just for the Jews. It is for all. And so, and I think that the core of that message is greatly informed by his Hellenistic upbringing and his exposure to a lot of Hellenistic philosophy that is not strictly Jewish. Philo of Alexandria is somebody who is kind of bridges that gap in some ways, but it is the universal nature of the sovereign Lord rather than Yahweh, the cultic deity, who is only the God of the Hebrews. That is something that is very deep at play in how he interacts with James and Peter and many other of your more strictly Jewish evangelizers. So, any other questions before I continue? I love questions. If I say I don't know, I'm sorry, but please. The Common Era, it is more or less a politically correct terminology that looks at time in terms of how, in terms of multiple religions being able to relate to it rather than before Christ and Agnus Domini in the year of our Lord, if you're Muslim or if you are Jewish or Buddhist. Yeah, it's... Sure. Oh, you're asking why they chose those terms instead. It is more or less still in relationship to Christ, to Jesus, because it is the birth of Jesus and the events set in place by his life and death that completely redefined the Western Empire, Romans, and then all throughout history. And so that year marker, that time marker, is no less significant, even though they don't want to use explicitly Christian terminology. The time reference is still to the same things. So, is that good enough? Cool. So, all right. Anything else? Okay, so let's move on to our sources. Does anybody know what the word extant means? E-X-T-A-N-T. Exists, yes. We only have 7 extant letters of Paul. According to scholars, and if you were to ask me why in detail they think only 7 of the 13 letters in the Bible is, I would say because my seminary book said so. So, in order of what the books were written, you have 1 Thessalonians around 50 CE, then you have Galatians around 53, 1 Corinthians around 53, 54, Philippians and Philemon both around 55, 2 Corinthians around 56, 57, and Romans around 57. These are the best estimates we have. We have a couple of fragments of different copies of the letter, but no original manuscripts, obviously, are extant any longer. Then you have the Deutero-Pauline letters, which are Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. Scholars would generally agree that these were written by first-generation Pauline communities in Paul's name, but probably not by Paul's hand. And then you have the pseudepigraphical letters. That name, or that word is so hard to say. Pseudepigraphical. It is first and 2 Timothy and Titus. And this is where you see a lot of the household codes. A lot of the most blatant and strict condemnations of women in ministry, among other things. And I'm sure you all will get into that when you study these letters specifically. Those are thought to be second, third, or maybe even 4th generation Pauline, but pretty far removed from what we see as the core of Paul's message. So, as well as the Greek grammar and phraseology that I couldn't tell you anything about because I can't read Greek. So these, and then you have Acts, which Acts is a funny thing because you have it telling about the events of Saul and then Paul. It's not as accurate as some people think, mostly because it doesn't match up with the letters of what Paul said himself. Some of it tends to be accurate, but we already have questions about whether Acts was written even by Luke, by the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And that's a question for another day. But the main sources we have, and the most reliable about Paul's life, are the 7 what scholars call authentic or undisputed letters. And so I draw primarily upon those. I will refer to the other ones from time to time, but one that is interesting is 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians and 3 Corinthians and 4 Corinthians and possibly 5 Corinthians. If you look at 2 Corinthians, there are at least 3 letters found in 2 Corinthians. It's spliced together. The manuscripts and the fragments that we have of the writing show that the letters were put together and then they try to put in their own segues. But that is going to be something that I hope you all find very interesting when you get to 1 Corinthians. But we know that the correspondence between the Corinthians was one of, if not the most significant correspondences that he had with any of the communities that he set up. The first letter establishes quite a relationship, not only between, in terms of the religion that was currently going on there, which was something that was very similar found in Athens in terms of the unnamed God, and gods that were given significance even though they weren't given a name. And Paul utilized this quite brilliantly to say, the God you worship, to the unnamed God, let me tell you the name of that God. And from there, it's all history. So that is, I'm not going to go into any other letters specifically unless you all would like, but those are ones that I would start with in preparation for this study, begin reading up on. By the way, at the very end, I brought a couple of books with me that I'll show you all that I have used as references. I've got plenty more if you all would like references. So, questions? Yes. I mean, we can look at it as best as scholars best know how and say, well, this looks like there are two different topics here. And I used to know it a lot better when I was... I will do my very best. It's been a long, long time since I've looked at that text specifically. And I honestly don't even know if this is the same Bible that I had when I took that class. I don't have it right now. What I will do is I will send Pastor Bill an email with my notes when I find my old Bible at home. And I will make sure that he relays those to you so that you all can look at them. And there's also, we know that the 1 Corinthians is not actually the first letter because there's a reference to a previous letter in 1 Corinthians. And so what we call, it's the first that we have. So, pardon? Yeah, so far, yes. So, yeah, no, but it's a great question, and I wish I had my other Bible where I had noted those. I didn't come planning to look at any of the texts in too much detail, but I will do the best I can on the fly. Is there any other questions about the letters? Okay, cool. So now I want to move to the last part and probably the longest part of this lecture. That is the major themes that you're going to see in Paul's writings. The first one is not his theme, but one that I have seen and that I think is very important, is that Paul was not a Christian. Paul, until the day he died, was a Jew. And at the time, you can also look at the same in terms of Peter, in terms of James and John. To be a Christian and to be a Jew was not mutually exclusive. The Messiah, the Son of God had come, and the Son of Man was to come. And so you hear in Acts, and then you hear again in Galatians, that Paul was a Pharisee, and that he had this conversion on the road to Damascus that we hear about. Let me read out of Philippians 3, 5 through 6. Paul tells us that he was circumscribed on the 8th day of the people of Israel of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. And that is Paul himself. Now, the funny thing is that when you take a look at another book or letter, let's say Romans, because that's the one that's probably my favorite Pauline letter, mostly because it's the one that confuses me the most, is that first 3 chapters is establishing what it means to live by faith, live by the law, and what does the role of works have to do with this. The other is how Paul looks at Judaism and interprets that to the Gentiles. Those are the 2 key practices and themes in Paul's ministry that will show you the evolution of his Judaism, but nevertheless his faithfulness to it. So, Pharisees. Does anybody remember something specific about the Pharisees? Sorry, I'm doing question and answer. I know I was told that was a no-no. Absolutely, that is perfectly correct, yes. Anything else? Okay, one thing about the Pharisees that was quite interesting is they believed in the existence of another Torah, the oral Torah, that was a oral tradition handed down to Moses along with the written Torah that basically gave the details of and told us how to interpret the law. And so when you see Pharisees nitpicking, for a lack of a better words, you hear the the New Testament writers, especially Matthew and Mark, and to some extent in John, nitpicking, finding all these very specifics of how they're not following the law. That is a Pharisaic tradition. It's the interpretation of the law. Well, the thing with Paul's teachings about Christ is it's not much different. It's a reinterpretation, and it's becoming more specific about how Christ functions within the Jewish covenant and also outside of it. Jesus was also the same way. If you think about the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard it said before, but I say to you. Jesus was always using that Pharisaic tradition to reinterpret and making more specific. And so you see that even though Paul, quote unquote, converts from what we have been told in Sunday school before when we were kids, he converts from being a Jew to a Christian. He still remains a Jew to the end of his days. And so that also colors how he understands the scriptures when he reinterprets them to the communities that he's ministering to. And so let's look at the justification by faith versus the law in Romans. Paul there says that if you seek to be justified by the law, be justified by the law and be blameless under the law. But for the Gentiles, they have never had the law, and they can be justified through faith alone. Now, then you hear him throwing these words of works, and that gets pretty convoluted very quickly, and this is where we hear a lot of people quoting selectively Romans in terms of how they understand salvation, justification, faith, etc. In my reading, and this has been backed up by a couple of the scholars that I've read as well, works is very different than the law in Paul's eyes. Faith is the lens by which one lives out their life in service to God. It is the framework, it is that through which everything they do. It is almost the internal matching the external. So for Jews who follow the law very strictly, you can follow the law, but if they become merely works, then there is no faith there. The law can be followed with faith. And the same for the Gentiles who never received the law. They can live their lives because the law is written on their hearts. That's what it says in Romans 2 or 3. And so that faith is that through which they live by, and that informs everything that they do. It's the center of their journey in service of God. That is a big theme for Paul throughout, and especially in Romans, when you see him 7 years later after writing Thessalonians, telling them to prepare for the coming of Christ, and Christ still has not come. His tone switches more towards how do we live out our lives in community with one another. So there's a pretty big switch there in tone and in theme as you get to the later of Paul's letters. So I hope you all, as you study Paul, will pay attention to that switch. All right. The next theme, actually, I'm going to stick with the pattern. Q&A. Any questions? Was it that bad or that good? All right. So the next theme is the theme of empire. I mentioned this briefly about the term Kyrios and Lord and Paul's place in the empire. So we know Paul is a Roman citizen. We know that Paul is raised under the Greek understanding of the Hebrew scriptures. And for more or less, he's been raised in the mindset of empire for government. He's now in the era of the Roman Empire. So when the Septuagint, which means 70, by the way, the legend is that 70 rabbis sat down and all translated the text in separate rooms away from each other, and when they came together, they had the exact same translation. So when the Septuagint has the translated word of God from those personal deity in terms of Yahweh, specific to the Israelites, the God of the Israelites or of the Hebrews, gets translated into more universal terms like Kyrios or Lord, the sovereign over all. The use of that term when Paul converts to the risen Christ, and that's the kind of term I want to use, converts to the risen Christ, is not only a supreme theological and cosmological praise, but it's also political praise. Paul calling Christ was a direct act of treason against the Roman Empire because Julius Caesar, or the Roman emperor, was Lord of all. And you see this trend, I think, started with Paul. One, because I think Paul knew much more the significance of it than the apostles did, because he spent so much time in circles that were not Jewish. He was raised in Tarsus, which is a thriving business community. And also because Paul's letters were written, Thessalonians was written probably about 25 years before the first gospel, which is Mark. And so Paul's ministry, one of the reasons why he was arrested so much, scholars think, is because of his continuous treasonous language. And that brings another element to the courage of what Paul was doing that entire time, that it just adds that layer of the persecution he was willing to endure. And so when you see that throughout these letters, think about what context he might precisely be taking a jab at the empire. Because it's not just, in general, Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not. But there are a lot of things going on in Roman history. Certainly you have within 15 years of writing that letter, of writing Thessalonians, that you see the Jewish-Roman war escalate to almost the mass extinction of Jews in the Roman Empire. And the only ones left were the Christians. Because, well, I need to digress on that. But pay attention to that, because there's a lot of political themes there that enrich that story. Okay, so then you have the famous quote in Galatians. There are neither Jews nor Greeks, nor slaves, nor free, nor women, nor men. Question for the audience. I know I'm going to get in trouble for doing this. What does that mean to you all? I know what it means, what it sounds like. What does it mean to you all? Do you all know the passage that I'm referring to? No, I think that definitely it has a lot to do with the reversal of power and the leveling of power, for sure. Absolutely. And we see that also, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. I'm trying to find the exact quote so that I'm not leaving you all in the dark. By the way, while I'm on this, do you all know how the letters of Paul are organized in the canonical text? Pardon? Yes, exactly. Make sure that we don't read those in order thinking that they are in chronological order. I'm blanking on where it is. Anybody want to look for it while I keep talking? The one on, there are neither Jews nor Greeks nor slaves nor free. Somebody want to look for it while I'm in here? Okay, that's fine. I wish I knew the exact verse. So when you're looking at Paul's relationship to Gentiles and other pagan religions, pay attention to the imagery that he uses to describe Christianity. One of the big ones is the Lord's Supper. This is the first time we ever see the Lord's Supper mentioned in a text in terms of its chronological order. It's the earliest. One of the cults in Greek religions, the cult of Dionysus, was very big on drinking the blood and eating the flesh of their deity. And the appeal to that specifically, the use of that imagery, is what I think something that Paul uses to help those groups understand the importance of that event the night before Christ died. And if you think about, and I actually put a bookmark in this one so I don't have to look for it. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup, also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." This is Communion Sunday, right? Isn't it? Didn't we just have communion? Yeah. I figured that was pretty fitting to bring up. So the imagery of that, Paul mixes in with pagan groups. And now don't get me wrong. You're going to hear some scholars say that a lot of the Gospel's stories are made up and that they are stolen from other cultic religions around the area. That is not what I'm claiming at all. There's a lot of evidence for the historicity of all the things that happen in here. But Paul is very brilliant. He's a brilliant rhetorician in that he uses the imagery that's already found in their culture to help them understand and to translate the message of Christ to these groups that he's evangelizing. And that is probably the reason why Christianity is around today. So, the final theme I want to talk about is Paul's apocalyptic worldview. All right, let me stop again. Any questions about the previous one? I'm really bad at this. Oh, yes, she answered the question. I think when the canon was put together originally, which was about the late 4th century, so 365, 370 was when we have the first canon order, and it becomes solidified fully in about 422. Technically, according to the Catholics, it was solidified in about 1580 when Luther tried to change the Bible. Or no, it was not 1580. It was somewhere around that time, but it was in response to Luther trying to take James out of the text. Don't quote me on that year. But when they put them in there, originally it was in terms of length. Paul's letters are ordered longest to shortest. And you'll notice that Hebrews, even though it's longer than a lot of the other letters, is not considered in that order, which leads us to believe that Hebrews was not even considered an authentic Pauline letter then. So some scholars still today will claim that it is authentically Pauline. So, yes, that's... Yeah, when I was at school at OU, we had a lot of people who were still in the Dallas Theological Seminary camp, which is also the ones who are working towards proving that King James has the largest majority text in terms of the accuracy of... And so these are the type of arguments that I learned how to respond to. But the Hebrews is certainly out of a Pauline community. It's a very late Pauline community. Probably a very late Pauline community that took a very different path, very different path than what Titus did. Much more Gnostic, mystical, rather than the rigid, strict, and governing every part of life, like the household codes you would see in Titus and in the 1st and 2nd Timothy. So, yeah. Is there any other questions? Awesome. Okay. The last part of the last theme I want to talk about with Paul is his apocalyptic worldview. Paul believed very strongly that his generation would be the last generation of humans on earth. And that had a very big impact on the advice that he gave to his communities that he had discipled, especially early on. You'll see in 1 Thessalonians. You do not know the hour or the minute when Christ will come, for example. And it's funny because when you look at 2 Thessalonians, which is not considered Pauline, there's advice quite to the contrary that says, don't stop doing your daily work. You still have to eat. You still have to drink. And so when you're going about your daily lives, don't just sit there every moment, every day expecting Christ to come and not having to do the things you've had to do all along. And it's kind of a backstepping of a later Pauline community. But those first 2 or 3 letters, so Thessalonians, Galatians, and especially Corinthians, where you see the most developed interaction of how the communities live in Christian community. Pay attention to those in terms of what it might mean in their minds to be expecting the coming of Christ. 1 Corinthians is one of my favorites, and it is one that rides that middle ground between how should we live in community, but ultimately this is not where we will be, and it will be soon. And there's not much more to say on that right now, because I don't want to spoil it for the different letters you're going to read. But I want to definitely bring your awareness to that, because it will, I think, enrich in your study of the Pauline letters. So, okay, I guess I will conclude here. And as we end today, and you all prepare to study Paul for the next several weeks / decades, a few things I want you to keep in the back of your mind. 1, Paul was a Hellenistic Jew who had both ancient Israelite and Roman lineages. Throughout his life, none of these aspects ever ceased to inform any part of his ministry. They're all wrapped up in one. And second of all, with Paul, what you see is not what you get. The extant or surviving letters of Paul show only one part of Paul while hinting at much more. Don't be too quick to lock Paul into a box, because that's what I did when I first started studying him. And he's much more dynamic than you think, and can show you a lot about what it means to do ministry outside of the context that you're used to, if you let him. So, with that being said, thank you all for allowing me to come and teach a little bit, and for bearing with me. It's been a few years since I've given a lecture, so I hope I have said something that helps out. So, thank you. A book that I'm on, right? Yeah, a book that I used in seminary, a couple books, but my favorite one was The Letters of Paul, Conversations in Context. It's by Calvin J. Rotzel, Roetzell, and I'll pass it around if you all want to look at it, or if you all do want to write this down. And then there's an introduction to Paul and Hans Kung's great Christian thinkers that I also love, and I would highly recommend that. But if you all, I've got other books about Paul if you all really just want to dive into Paul. But if not, just let me know. I would be more than happy to give you some more references. So.